Some truths lie quietly in the walls of old places, stitched into lace, hidden beneath family names, waiting to surface when love and legacy collide. Tonight's story is one of silence broken and secrets that refused to stay buried. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The narrow road into Elmswood Cove twisted gently between rows of spruce and birch, the Atlantic mist brushing the treetops like a breath from the past. Jessica Fletcher eased her rental car to a stop before the ivy-framed Allendale Inn and sat for a quiet moment, absorbing the familiar hush that only coastal New England seemed to carry. There was something comforting about the rhythm of old shingles, wind-worn porches, and signs hand-lettered generations ago. She stepped out into the salt-kissed air and smiled to herself. Her goddaughter Charlotte had always dreamed of a wedding by the sea, and Elmswood, with its clipped hedges, shuttered windows, and ever-watchful gulls, seemed the perfect place to begin a new chapter. Still, Jessica had long since learned that even the most picturesque villages held shadows in their corners. The innkeeper, a pale, cheerful woman named Maisie, greeted her with the warmth of someone who remembered hospitality before reservation systems. Jessica's suite smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. There was a writing desk, a porcelain lamp, and a shelf lined with forgotten novels. She unpacked her suitcase slowly, laying her notebook carefully on the desk. It was only later, walking down to the main parlour for tea, that she heard the name Barlow spoken in a lowered tone. The couple by the fireplace quickly fell silent as she passed. Jessica noted it gently, not with alarm, but with a flicker of interest. She had learned long ago that gossip was rarely born without cause. The next morning, Charlotte insisted on taking Jessica to the Allendale Chapel, the chosen site for the ceremony. The building stood on a hill overlooking the water, its slate roof mottled with age and its wooden steeple slightly leaning like an elder, listening carefully. Inside, the air was cool and scented with beeswax and pine. The stained glass cast gentle hues across the pews, amber, rose, and blue. Jessica ran a hand along the back of one bench and imagined the hundreds of vows whispered into this stillness, promises etched into silence and dust. As Charlotte wandered off to speak with the caretaker, Jessica let her gaze drift upward. Ivy pressed insistently through the outer stones, curling toward the ceiling, as if reclaiming the structure inch by inch. There was something melancholic about it, not tragic, but watchful. This was a place where people came to begin their futures, and perhaps to bury parts of their past. She thought again of the hushed tones at the inn. Was it merely small-town habit, or something deeper folded between the vows and the lace? By late afternoon, the inn was filled with the quiet bustle of pre-wedding arrivals. Luggage was carried up old staircases, names were called from the porch, and the scent of simmering chowder drifted from the kitchen. Jessica sat in the parlour reading a short biography of Elmswood's founder when she saw a tall man pause in the entryway. Roger Pierce. Charlotte's father had been absent from her life for over a decade. His letters, if they had come at all, had been brief and unreadable. But now he stood, awkward and slightly sunburned, as if he had returned from another country, not geographically, but emotionally. Jessica rose and greeted him gently. "Roger, you made it." His smile was tentative. "Couldn't let my daughter walk down the aisle without me, could I?" There was affection in his voice, but something guarded too. He kept glancing toward the stairway, as though expecting someone else. It wasn't long after that Jessica noticed Vivian Barlow standing near the hearth, speaking quietly with her brother Nate. Her face, usually composed, held the tightness of unspoken strain. When Jessica approached, Vivian managed a polite smile, but her fingers twisted the ring on her right hand until the knuckle paled. Jessica filed the gesture away quietly, the way one notes the faintest change in weather. Weddings often stirred memories, regrets, and nerves, but in this gathering The shadows seemed to precede the ceremony. The rehearsal dinner was held in the Allendale Inn's conservatory, a glass-walled room warmed by golden evening light and the quiet clinking of crystal. Long tables had been dressed in white linen, sprigs of rosemary tied around each napkin. Jessica sat near the head of the table beside Charlotte, who radiated gratitude and nervous joy in equal measure. The toasts were heartfelt and brief. Roger, slightly flushed from wine, offered a halting tribute to new beginnings, while Vivian raised her glass to family traditions with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And then the door opened. A woman in a navy coat stepped inside, her heels softly tapping against the tile. The air shifted, as if someone had opened a window on a winter day. "Diana," Nate breathed, rising halfway from his chair. Charlotte turned, her posture stiffening. Jessica watched her goddaughter's face, searching for hurt, but what she saw instead was confusion. Diana Lowell walked toward them with the poise of someone who expected to be here, even as every eye followed her like a dropped glass. "I was told I had an invitation," she said evenly, looking at Nate, not Charlotte. "You didn't," Vivian said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy. Nate looked torn between explanation and apology. Charlotte's voice, when it came, was steady but cool. "Perhaps we should speak privately." Jessica felt the tension like a low hum. Not quite danger, not yet, but something unspoken had slipped into the evening, and it wouldn't be leaving quietly. Later that night, unable to sleep, Jessica wandered into the bridal suite to check on Charlotte. She found her alone, seated by the vanity with the veil in her lap. The lace shimmered softly in the lamplight, delicate and time-worn. "There's a tear," Charlotte said, barely above a whisper. "I must have snagged it when I stood." Jessica sat beside her. The tear was no longer than a finger's width, but in its frayed edges something felt symbolic, a fissure where things should have held. "Some things mend easily," Jessica said gently. "Others require time." Charlotte looked up, her eyes uncertain. "Do you think she came to ruin the wedding?" Jessica didn't answer directly. Her gaze returned to the torn veil. The past had already begun to unravel the ceremony. Whether it would mend, or unravel further, remained to be seen. The morning sun filtered through the chapel's high windows, casting coloured pools of light across the pews. It should have felt celebratory, Jessica thought. The soft echo of violin notes rose and fell, like distant waves as the small group assembled. Charlotte, in her cream rehearsal dress, rehearsed her steps with meticulous grace. Her hands trembled only slightly at her sides. Jessica sat quietly in a rear pew, a hymnal in her lap, though she had no intention of singing. Her gaze drifted between the players, Vivian, poised and brisk with a clipboard, Nate, attentive but unusually distracted, and Diana seated discreetly at the back, her eyes unreadable. The atmosphere was not joyful, but charged. Every smile felt rehearsed, every silence stretched a moment too long. Jessica noted Roger Pierce standing awkwardly near the back, watching Charlotte with a kind of wistful regret. The caretaker gave instructions in a whisper. The officiant nodded. A few chairs were adjusted, and Charlotte's veil, mended from the night before, now looked whole again, though Jessica couldn't help but glance at the repaired seam, wondering if appearances were more fragile than they seemed. Then, without warning, Vivian stepped aside and disappeared into the small vestry room. No one seemed to notice, until they did. Moments passed. The violin trailed into silence. The Reverend looked up. And then came the scream. The sound cracked through the chapel like glass, shattering against stone. Jessica rose before she realized she had, her instincts sharper than any reflex. Charlotte dropped her bouquet. Nate was already moving toward the vestry, pale and tight-jawed. Inside the narrow room, lit only by a sliver of high window, Vivian lay slumped beside the altar-cloth chest. Her skin had gone ashen, her lips slightly parted. The glass water bottle she had carried that morning had tipped onto the floor, its contents forming a slow, spreading stain across the flagstones. Jessica moved carefully, kneeling just close enough to observe without disturbing anything. She touched Vivian's wrist, cold, still. Behind her, the chapel had fallen silent. The musicians stood frozen. The minister made a small, helpless sound. "Call the sheriff," Jessica said gently. "Now." Nate knelt beside his sister, then recoiled slightly, as if realizing something he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. Charlotte hovered in the doorway, her fingers pressed to her lips. It wasn't grief yet, it was disbelief. Grief would come later. Jessica's eyes lingered on the bottle. The label had peeled slightly at one edge, as though recently wetted. A faint, bitter scent hung in the air. Familiar, distinct. She didn't speak of it, not yet. But even as the sirens approached in the distance, Jessica Fletcher's mind had already begun to piece together the day's quiet disruptions, the torn veil, the tension at the rehearsal dinner, the way Vivian had kept glancing at her brother when she thought no one was looking. Death rarely arrived without whispering first. Sheriff Maddox arrived within the hour, his leather boots clicking across the chapel floor as though echoing the finality of his presence. He was a careful man, soft-spoken, with the kind of patience that made him appear slow, until he wasn't. "Crushed oleander leaves," he murmured, after examining the residue in the water bottle. "Lethal in the right dose, grows wild just outside the estate fence." He didn't look at Jessica as he said it, but she sensed the invitation in his tone. The two had worked together once, years ago, on a boating accident that turned out to be neither. Charlotte stood to one side, pale as her veil, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Nate had withdrawn into silence, his eyes cast downward. Diana Lowell lingered near the organ, saying little, her presence now feeling far less incidental. Jessica stepped back from the gathering crowd, her mind turning quietly. Vivian had been precise, detail-oriented. She wouldn't have mistaken an unfamiliar bottle, nor would she have taken something from a stranger's hand without question, which meant the bottle had appeared familiar, or had been hers all along. "May I?" Jessica asked the sheriff, pointing to Vivian's clipboard and belongings. He nodded. Among the rehearsal notes, timings, music cues, guest arrivals, Jessica found a folded piece of paper tucked near the back. A speech, perhaps, number A, checklist. But at the very bottom, a handwritten note, "Speak to Nate before the vows." Not after. Before. Jessica folded it slowly, her mind catching on that phrasing. Not a formality, a confrontation. And now, silence. If Vivian had known something that could upend the ceremony, the inheritance, or the family's already faltering balance, that could very well be motive enough. The question, of course, was, for whom? That evening, the chapel was cordoned off, the guests scattered, the wedding postponed indefinitely. Jessica found Charlotte alone in the reading room of the inn, her gaze locked on the flames in the hearth as though they might burn away the uncertainty. "I don't understand," Charlotte whispered, barely glancing up. "She was difficult sometimes, but Vivian wouldn't have done anything to hurt the wedding." "Not really." Jessica sat beside her. She may not have intended harm, but she may have known something that could have changed everything. Charlotte turned to her, a flash of fear in her eyes. "Do you think, Nate?" Jessica held up a hand gently. "I don't know yet, but whatever happened, we must look past grief and look closely at truth." Charlotte nodded slowly. "People keep saying it was just a mistake. But Vivian was meticulous. She would never drink from someone else's bottle. She labelled everything she owned." Jessica noted the comment with quiet appreciation. A detail that might otherwise go unspoken, but in this case it lingered. If the bottle had been hers, someone had tampered with it. If it wasn't, someone had been trusted enough to make the switch unnoticed. Trust was often the easiest disguise. Down the hallway, Jessica heard the distant murmur of voices, Roger's low baritone, Diana's clipped tones, someone stifling tears. The fractures had begun. And Jessica knew from experience the first cracks were rarely the most dangerous. It was what poured through them that mattered. Later that night, long after the guests had retreated to their rooms, Jessica returned to the chapel. She asked the caretaker, a kindly man named Emery, for a final look at the rehearsal materials before they were locked away. In the vestry's soft lamplight, Jessica sorted through the service programs, music sheets, and one slightly worn script, the version Vivian had carried. Folded tightly into the center pages was a piece of stationery, the corners frayed from handling, never mailed. It began simply, "To the person I owe the most honesty." Jessica read on, each line carefully penned, but never completed. The writer's voice was uncertain, hesitant. There was a sense of emotional gravity, not rage, of something deeply personal. It wasn't addressed to anyone by name, nor did it reveal the secret Vivian seemed poised to disclose, but it spoke of knowing who I am and what that means for what comes next. Jessica held the page between her fingers. This wasn't blackmail, it was confession, or warning, possibly both. She tucked the letter into her notebook, the scent of oleander still faint in the air. Something had shaken Vivian, enough to consider disrupting the most important day of her brother's life. The question was whether someone else had found out first. The pews stood silent beneath the colored glass. Some truths, Jessica thought, never get to be spoken aloud. Others die with the one who dares to whisper them. Jessica stood alone beneath the chapel's ivy-draped archway, her fingertips brushing the edge of the folded letter in her coat pocket. Vivian's words still echoed in her mind. Unfinished thoughts suspended between fear and resolution. The soft clatter of carriage wheels on gravel signaled another guest's early departure. The wedding was no longer a celebration. It had shifted into something else, a reckoning. Later that morning, Jessica found herself seated in the garden at the inn, a teacup cooling at her side. She had invited Nate to join her, and he arrived, looking as though he hadn't slept. "She wasn't well, Jessica," he said quietly, eyes shaded beneath furrowed brows. "Vivian had episodes, paranoia, obsessions about the family history. I tried to help, but I think she spiraled." Jessica didn't contradict him, but neither did she agree. It's always hard to separate fact from fear when family is involved. Nate offered a humorless smile. That's one way to put it. From the corner of her eye, Jessica noticed Roger Pierce stepping out onto the inn's porch, then hesitating as he caught sight of Nate. A glance passed between them, brief, brittle. Jessica tucked that observation away. So far, the only thing truly shared among the guests was restraint. Later, she spoke with the innkeeper Maisie, who, in the gentle manner of small-town hosts, had learned a great deal without asking a single question. "Vivian was no stranger here," Maisie said, arranging a tray of sugar tarts. "She came alone every autumn, never brought company, always booked the same room, spent hours walking through the churchyard." "What was she looking for, do you think?" Jessica asked. Maisie only shrugged. "She once said, 'Some roots don't show above ground.' I thought she meant the ivy." But Jessica knew better. Vivian had been tracing something buried deeper than inheritance, something older than secrets. By midday, Jessica requested a quiet word with Edward Latimer, the Barlow family attorney, who had arrived that morning in a tweed coat and expression of controlled discomfort. He had been hired, Jessica remembered, years ago after Nathaniel's father passed, the sort of man who believed that discretion was the highest virtue. "I won't ask for anything official," Jessica said kindly. "Only what might help us understand Vivian's state of mind." Latimer hesitated, then poured himself a cautious inch of tea. "It was about the clause, of course. Vivian discovered it 2 weeks ago, just after reviewing her father's estate documentation for tax reasons. It was never hidden, simply overlooked, or rather, ignored." Jessica folded her hands. "What did it state?" "That should Vivian be proved to be the sole Barlow heir, meaning Nathaniel had no legal claim through biological lineage, she would inherit controlling interest in the family holdings. It was a clause never expected to be tested. Jessica's brow furrowed gently. But there was no indication Nate isn't a Barlow. Of course not, Latimer said, and no one doubts his parentage. But Vivian was fixated. She began to speak of adoption, falsified records. She even implied her own bloodline might be different. Jessica absorbed this silently. The clause wasn't just a legal footnote, it was a pressure point, and Vivian had placed her finger squarely on it. She thanked Latimer and left him to his cooled tea. Outside, ivy rattled softly in the breeze, clinging to the chapel stones like memory to the mind. Jessica paused. If Vivian had intended to confront Nate with what she believed, the timing, just before the vows, was no accident. It was meant to change something, or ruin it. Jessica found Diana Lowell standing beside the inn's rose trellis, her gloved fingers idly tracing a withered bloom. "You knew Vivian?" Jessica began gently. "Not just in passing?" Diana didn't flinch. "She wasn't someone you forgot." Jessica waited. Diana exhaled. "Vivian and I were in school together for 1 year. She was precise, brilliant, but always just slightly out of step. The sort of person who catalogued offences, tallied slights. She remembered everything." Jessica tilted her head. "And yet she never mentioned your arrival, nor did Nate." "That's because I didn't come on their invitation," Diana said, her voice crisp. "Someone mailed me a note, no signature, no return address, just a typed message. 'You may want to be there. Things are unraveling.'" Jessica studied her. "You travelled all this way on the strength of a cryptic letter?" "I did," Diana replied, "because whoever sent it knew something, and frankly, so did I. Nate's always needed rescuing from himself." The words hung between them, not bitter, but edged with resignation. Jessica considered the implications. Someone wanted Diana at the wedding. Someone who believed her presence might destabilize something, or someone. "Do you still care for him?" Jessica asked, not unkindly. Diana didn't answer, but she looked away. The invitation had brought Diana back into the fold, but was she here to protect Nate, or to watch what happened when old facades cracked open? Jessica glanced back at the inn. From the upper balcony, Charlotte stood at her window watching them both. So many watchers, Jessica thought, so few truths spoken aloud. Jessica remained in quiet thought long after Diana had retreated indoors. The roses trembled faintly in the afternoon wind, and the chapel's silhouette loomed beyond the hedgerow. It drew her gaze, not just architecturally, but intuitively. Some details cling like ivy, too subtle to command attention, yet impossible to ignore. She followed the gravel path around the back of the chapel, where the ivy had thickened over old stone, gnarled roots pushing up through the soil like fingers grasping from below. Near the eastern hedge, something glinted softly beneath a fern's drooping edge. Jessica bent to retrieve it, a gold wristwatch, its face cracked, its band unlatched. The glass had fractured in a spidering pattern, the hands frozen at precisely 10:24. She turned it gently in her palm. No initials. But the design was unmistakably feminine, elegant, and old. Vivian's. She recalled the rehearsal that morning. The water break had occurred just before 10:30. Vivian had excused herself from the pews to check the music notes in the vestry. Everyone had assumed it routine. But Jessica now saw that moment in a different light. The watch wasn't misplaced, it was dropped, perhaps wrestled off or jarred loose during a struggle. The surrounding hedge bore a subtle tear in the underbrush, as though someone had moved quickly through it. And yet no one had admitted seeing Vivian step outside. Jessica stood still for a long moment, letting the possibilities settle. If the watch had stopped at 10:24, the poisoning would have occurred minutes before anyone noticed her collapse inside, which meant someone had followed her or intercepted her. She tucked the watch carefully into her handbag, mindful of its cracked face. Time had stopped for Vivian at 10:24, but for the truth, it was just beginning to tick. That evening, Jessica sat in the drawing room near the fire, taking notes in her small leather-bound journal. The sound of quiet steps in the hallway pulled her attention. Roger Pierce entered hesitantly, a glass of water in hand, his tie loosened, his brow furrowed with the exhaustion of someone not used to being noticed. "Couldn't sleep," he said, offering a wry smile. "Too many ghosts in this place." Jessica returned the smile with warmth, but not without intent. "Places don't hold ghosts, Roger?" "People do." He lowered himself into the armchair opposite. "I suppose I deserve that." Jessica leaned slightly forward. "Maisie mentioned you were seen last night walking the chapel grounds." Past midnight, Roger's expression didn't shift, at first, but his hand tightened around the glass. "Habit, I suppose," he said slowly. "I always walk when I can't sleep. But I wasn't doing anything suspicious, Jessica. Just remembering." "Remembering Vivian?" she asked gently. A long pause followed. "I didn't expect her to be here," he admitted. "Not like that. She and we had a brief connection. Years ago, before Charlotte's mother. It was complicated. I thought I left it behind." "But Vivian hadn't," Jessica observed. "She sent me a letter last year, asked if I'd come back. Said there were things I needed to hear. I never replied." Jessica watched him carefully. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling her everything either. "Did you speak to her at all?" she asked. Number the Y avoided her. And now I wish I hadn't. Outside, the ivy rustled softly against the window. Secrets don't die with distance, Jessica thought. They simply grow in the dark until someone finally steps back into the light. The next morning, Jessica crossed paths with Diana again, this time in the library, where she sat paging through a local history of Elmswood Cove. The young woman looked up with a tight smile, more guarded now than before. Jessica approached slowly. "You mentioned something yesterday, about Vivian remembering everything, but you also said something else." Diana tilted her head. "Did I?" "You said things were unraveling, that whoever wrote to you knew something, but you didn't seem surprised when Vivian died." Diana closed the book, her fingers resting lightly on its spine. "I'm not cold, Jessica. Just prepared. Vivian wasn't the kind of person who lived quietly, and she wasn't the kind to die peacefully either." Jessica studied her. "Do you know what she intended to reveal?" Diana hesitated. Then, only that it had nothing to do with Nate. It was older than that, something she found years ago, something that, if true, would shame the family name beyond repair. Jessica felt a quiet chill. "Then why not say it outright?" "Because even the truth has victims," Diana replied. "Sometimes silence is kinder." Jessica left her to the books, and to her silence. But the idea lodged like a thorn. What truth could be so devastating that even murder seemed like the lesser harm? Jessica lingered at the threshold of Vivian's suite, the door still ajar from the sheriff's earlier sweep. The room had been left in careful disarray, drawers opened, notebooks photographed, the usual procedure. But procedure rarely noticed what wasn't missing. Her eyes moved to the writing desk in the corner. Beside a stack of stationery sat a shallow dish, intended perhaps for keys or spare buttons. Inside, half buried beneath a folded tissue, was a ring. It was old, the gold dulled by time, the solitaire small but elegant, with delicate engraving curling along the inner band. Jessica picked it up gently, turning it toward the light. T.H. The initials were faint, but still legible. Jessica's thoughts narrowed. Vivian had not been wearing this ring. It had not been mentioned in any account. Yet it had been placed, deliberately, she suspected, within reach. Not as a keepsake. As a clue. She slipped the ring into her notebook and made a silent mental note. Rings tell stories, even when the wearer is gone, especially when initials don't match the fiancé. She glanced again across the room. Everything about Vivian's space suggested intention: the symmetry of her belongings, the annotated books, the meticulous way the bed had been made. This wasn't a room left in haste. It was a room left ready for discovery. Jessica stepped out into the hallway, the faint scent of lavender trailing after her, and closed the door gently behind. There were questions now circling like gulls in her mind. Who was T.H.? Why had Vivian kept the ring hidden, yet not entirely concealed? And was this perhaps the secret she had hinted at revealing? The village library was small, sunlit, and arranged with the kind of care only seen in places where time moved slowly. Jessica stood by the genealogy section, her fingers tracing faded labels. She was looking for something or someone who might match those initials. "T.H., she murmured. There, tucked between a register of estate deeds and a faded volume of Elmswood war heroes, she found a crumbling book of local burial records. The name leapt from the page almost instantly. Theodore Harlan. Date of death, 1954. Occupation, groundskeeper, Barlow Estate. Jessica turned to the librarian, a soft-spoken man named Elliot. "Do you know anything about a Theodore Harlan?" He blinked, then smiled wistfully. "Ah, yes, Theo. My grandmother used to say he was born with dirt under his nails and a secret in his chest. Worked the gardens at the old Barlow place. Took pride in it, too." "Was there scandal?" she asked, her tone light but probing. Elliot's smile faded slightly. There were whispers that he was dismissed abruptly. Something about impropriety with one of the Barlow daughters. But those stories always go the same way, don't they? Man of lower station, young woman of name. No one proves anything, but he disappears. She marries someone suitable. Life goes on. Jessica nodded, absorbing the symmetry. A vanished man, a buried connection, and now, decades later, a ring resurfaced. If Vivian had found proof that she was Harlan's descendant and not a Barlow by blood, that would shift everything. The inheritance clause, the family name, Nate's standing, all of it. She thanked Elliot and closed the book softly. Truth, she thought, has a habit of pressing through even the oldest soil, like ivy through stone. But who else knew that story was coming to light? Back at the inn, the air had shifted. It was hard to explain. Quieter, yes, but more brittle. The kind of silence that clung to walls and made every closed door feel watched. Jessica returned to Vivian's suite. Sheriff Maddox had already completed his second round of forensics, and the room had been released to the family. With Nate avoiding visitors and Charlotte resting, Jessica took the liberty to finish what no one else seemed inclined to begin. Vivian's dresser had been tidied since her arrival, except for the narrow side drawer where Jessica found a stack of receipts and, beneath them, a slim, leather-bound journal no larger than a prayer book. She opened it carefully. Vivian's handwriting was neat, if sharp. Each entry began with a date and location: Barlow House grounds, Elmswood Historical Archive, Harlan grave marker. The entries were methodical, notes, references, lists of names, but beneath the structure ran something far more personal: worries, doubts, a fear that knowledge was becoming dangerous. "I've confirmed the records. I am not who I was told I am. My name, my place, it was all a fabrication to preserve theirs. If I speak, I lose them, but if I stay silent, I betray myself. They will never let this stand. Not with the wedding, not with Charlotte watching." Jessica paused at that last line. The pages that followed were blank. She set the book down, her mind already sorting through what this meant. Vivian had known. She had documented her discovery. She had feared exposure, but also seemed resolved to act. What she hadn't known or had underestimated was how far someone might go to stop her. Jessica folded the diary closed and slipped it into her bag. Her fingers brushed the engagement ring once more. If truth had been Vivian's burden, then perhaps silence had been her enemy. But someone else, someone nearby, had made truth a threat. And in Elmswood Cove, threats didn't always echo loudly. Sometimes they came in whispers, poisoned, polite, and deadly. Jessica left the suite with a new sense of weight, not panic, but the quiet recognition of danger woven not through threat, but through necessity. Some truths, once uncovered, reshape every relationship that came before them. Vivian had uncovered such a truth, and someone, she now believed, had known. Back in her room, Jessica spread her notes across the writing desk, the engagement ring, the initials, Theodore Harlan, the inheritance clause that favoured a true Barlow heir. Vivian's journal was no longer a collection of musings. It was evidence of intent. She hadn't been mourning lost love. She had been preparing to reclaim a legacy. Jessica's thoughts returned to Nate. His grief had felt real, but so had his silence. If Vivian proved to be the legitimate heir, through Harlan, not Barlow, the clause in the will would transfer controlling interest of the estate to her. Nate, once the unquestioned heir, would be legally diminished, and, socially, publicly exposed. His inheritance, his family name, his place at the altar, all threatened. And Charlotte, poor Charlotte. Her goddaughter stood in the middle of all this, unaware that the lace veil she wore might be shadowed by something far older and far crueler than heartbreak. Jessica turned to the margin notes in her notebook, half-formed thoughts about who had access to the vestry that morning, who had handled the water bottles, who had everything to lose. She had no proof, not yet, but something in her, a quiet, tightening certainty, was beginning to shift focus. This wasn't about betrayal of the heart. It was about lineage, power, and control. Someone had needed Vivian's silence, not out of passion, but preservation. And someone had ensured that silence permanently. Jessica found Diana alone on the rear veranda, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders despite the mild breeze. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and a folded slip of paper lay clenched in one hand. "I'm not proud of how I came back," Diana murmured, before Jessica could speak. "I told myself I was here for closure. But I think maybe I was here to watch it fall apart." Jessica sat beside her. "What's that in your hand?" Diana hesitated, then handed it over. A simple, typed message on unmarked paper. "You should never have come back." No signature, no envelope, just left outside her door. Jessica's fingers smoothed the page, but her thoughts were already shifting. Someone had wanted Diana here. Someone else had wanted her gone. Both messages sent in silence, anonymous, manipulative, and conflicting. "Did you show this to Nate?" Jessica asked. Diana shook her head. "Number I didn't want to seem fragile." Jessica nodded quietly. The note was a threat, yes, but one designed to appear vague, possibly even self-inflicted. Red herring or warning, that was unclear, but Diana's tears were not false. And yet tears, Jessica knew, did not equal innocence. Only motive could explain intent. And this note added yet another. The next day a luncheon was held, small, sombre, subdued. Guests spoke in hushed voices, every chair half filled. At the centre table, a crystal basket of cranberries, bright and glistening, had been placed as decoration, a nod to the Barlow estate's legacy. Jessica watched as a waiter passed too closely, brushing the table's edge. The basket tipped, the berries rolled across the white linen, vivid red against pale cloth, scattering like marbles in all directions. A few gasps, someone whispered apologies. But Jessica saw more than a mess. She saw a symbol of something once sweet turned sour, of purity stained, of a legacy slipping from its pedestal. Charlotte sat rigidly at the table, her hands motionless. Nate's napkin remained untouched in his lap. And across the table, Diana met Jessica's gaze and offered the smallest of nods. No one spoke of the spill, but all had seen it, and Jessica knew the fruit had fallen. The question was who had let it rot. Jessica stepped through the weathered oak doors of the Elmswood Cove Town Records Office, greeted by the familiar scent of old paper and linseed oil. The clerk, a bespectacled man named Mr. Pratt, offered a nod of recognition. Small towns remember names quickly, especially when a mystery is in the air. "I was hoping to consult a few adoption records," Jessica said with a polite smile. "From the early 1960s, Barlow family connections, if possible." Mr. Pratt hesitated only briefly. "Well, nothing sealed by court order, of course, but let me see what's public." He returned minutes later with a slim folder, worn at the edges. Jessica opened it slowly, her fingers resting on the document labelled Vivian Elsbeth Barlow, adopted March 1962. The names listed beneath it made her breath catch. Birth mother, Elena Mireille Duval. Her hand stilled. Elena, Charlotte's mother. The records were factual, unembellished. The dates aligned with Elena's quiet disappearance from public view before her marriage to Roger Pierce. Vivian had been raised as a Barlow, but her true bloodline had nothing to do with them. Jessica thought of the journal entries, the torn veil, the hidden ring. The family tree had been grafted, not grown. And no one had spoken of it. Not to Vivian, not to Charlotte. She thanked Mr. Pratt and left with a photocopy tucked into her notebook. Outside, the breeze stirred gently through the village square, scattering petals from the courthouse garden. Elena had kept the secret for decades. But secrets don't age well. They ripen, then they rot. And someone, Vivian, had finally gotten too close to the truth. And perhaps someone else had feared what would happen when that truth was no longer theirs to control. That afternoon, Jessica returned alone to the Allendale Chapel. The sanctuary was quiet now, no musicians, no whispered tension, only the faint creak of the pews and the lingering scent of beeswax polish. She stood near the altar, closing her eyes for a moment. Memory filled the silence, Charlotte stepping forward in her cream rehearsal dress, Vivian disappearing briefly with her clipboard, the musicians pausing mid-measure for water. And then, the scream. Jessica began to retrace the sequence, step by careful step. Vivian had been seated to the right of the musicians before her departure. The bottled water had been placed on a narrow refreshment table just behind the pews. Everyone had broken briefly, each returning with a bottle. Jessica knelt beside the table, noting a faint ring of moisture left behind. Her gaze drifted to the floor beneath the seats. Something had bothered her that morning, not a noise, but an absence. She remembered Vivian rejoining them with damp hands, brushing them subtly against her skirt. It wasn't unusual, except no one recalled her drinking. Jessica's deduction began to coalesce. Vivian had stepped away. She'd touched the water bottles. She'd never taken a sip. And someone else had taken advantage of that moment. She moved to the front pew, brushing the velvet cushion with her hand. One thread caught on her glove, barely visible, nearly forgotten. But there it was, the place where time had slowed just enough for death to be planted. Not an overt act, not an angry gesture, just a switch. The question now wasn't whether someone had tampered with Vivian's drink. The question was how they had done it without anyone noticing, and whether that moment had been planned all along. Her thoughts circling, Jessica began a slower sweep of the area behind the musicians' seating. There, caught in the shadows beneath the fourth pew, a small object glinted faintly. A plastic bottle cap, green, ridged, and cracked at one edge. She stooped to retrieve it, brushing away the dust. The break in the cap was subtle but sharp, as though it had been removed hastily, perhaps even stepped on. Vivian's water bottle had had no cap when it was found, just a spill across the vestry floor. The sheriff had assumed it had been discarded, or misplaced. But discarded things don't hide. They don't wedge themselves into forgotten corners. Jessica turned the cap over in her hand. A faint trace of pollen clung to the plastic, caught in the groove. Yellow, barely visible, but familiar. Oleander. The poison hadn't just been mixed in, it had been handled, transferred. And this cap, tucked silently underfoot, might be the quietest witness in the room. Who had brought the water bottles to the chapel that morning? Who had access to the plants? Who had moved without drawing attention? She slipped the cap into a paper envelope and sealed it in her bag. So many acts of violence leave sound, spectacle, alarm. But this murder had been a whisper, and whispers don't vanish, they echo, if you know where to listen. That evening, Jessica requested a word with Eleanor. They met on the covered porch at the rear of the inn, where the air was still and thick with the scent of peonies. Elena held a shawl around her shoulders, her expression weary but composed. "I've uncovered something," Jessica began gently. "In the adoption records." Elena's hands, clasped tightly in her lap, didn't move. "I wondered when you would." Jessica offered no judgment, only understanding. "Vivian was your daughter?" "Yes." The word barely broke the silence. "And I gave her up because I had no choice. I was young, alone. Theodore had already been dismissed from the estate. My father insisted that the scandal would ruin us." Jessica nodded, letting her speak in her own time. "They arranged it quietly," Eleanor continued. "The Barlows, they took her in. She was renamed, recast, placed in the very family that had banished her father. I thought, somehow, it was a kindness." "She found out," Jessica said softly. Eleanor's eyes filled. "She confronted me a year ago. I begged her not to tell Charlotte, not before the wedding. I said it would devastate her." "And did you believe that was enough?" Jessica asked. "To keep her silent?" "I didn't kill her," Elena said, the words emerging all at once. "God help me, I didn't. But I might have broken her heart." Jessica reached out, placing a hand over hers. "You were protecting the wrong thing." Eleanor looked away. The tragedy wasn't just the secret. It was the years of silence wrapped around it. What had been done in the name of protection had grown into something else: shame, hidden inheritance, and perhaps motive for murder. Jessica stood, her mind turning once again to the cap, the broken watch, and the sudden shifts during the rehearsal. Elena hadn't poisoned her daughter, but someone who feared what Vivian knew had. Before returning to her room, Jessica stopped briefly in the music alcove of the chapel, where the instruments had been stored following the rehearsal. The violinists had gathered their belongings hurriedly after Vivian's death, and most items had been removed, but one case remained, leaning against the side wall, forgotten or left intentionally. Jessica approached it slowly. The exterior was worn black leather, the handle cracked, but her attention settled on a faint smear along the brass clasp, a yellowish-green dust, pollen. She lifted the corner of her handkerchief and dabbed gently. A smear confirmed her suspicion. Oleander, again. Someone had brushed the plant, or something coated in it, against this surface, and only someone close to the musicians' area during the water break could have done so. Jessica's thoughts turned to motive and movement. The case hadn't been near Vivian, but someone near the case had moved during that crucial interval. Quietly, deliberately. The poison had never needed to be seen, only planted. She folded the handkerchief and tucked it away. The next question wasn't who had the most to gain. It was who had remained just quiet enough to go unnoticed. The drawing room of the Allendale Inn had always been charming, chintz curtains, polished mahogany, and the distant hum of the sea filtering through the windows. But today it felt different, heavier. Still, Jessica knew that some truths required a setting both intimate and disarming. She had asked for everyone to gather, and they had come, quietly, hesitantly. Nate stood near the mantel, hands clasped behind his back. Charlotte sat close to Eleanor, her face pale, her fingers twined with a handkerchief. Roger lingered by the door. Diana stood slightly apart, posture composed but wary. Jessica remained by the window, her notebook in hand. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice calm but firm. What happened to Vivian was not an accident. It was not hysteria. It was murder, committed with precision and silence. A murmur of protest stirred, but she continued. I've spent the past days piecing together the pattern. Vivian was not trying to stop a wedding. She was trying to reclaim her name, her place, her truth. She paused, letting the words settle. I found pollen from oleander, the plant used in her poisoning, on a discarded bottle cap and a violin case. The bottle was hers, yes, but someone had the opportunity to contaminate it during the rehearsal break. Nate looked up sharply. And that someone, Jessica said, gently but pointedly, knew where Vivian would sit, what she would reach for, and why her silence mattered. She closed her notebook softly. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was one of calculations and protection. The room held its breath, and Jessica's mind moved forward to bloodlines, to inheritance, and to the one motive that never fades, fear of losing everything. Jessica shifted her attention to the piano, where a single page of sheet music remained from the rehearsal. A small gesture, but it had been Vivian's. She touched the corner gently. Vivian discovered that she was not a Barlow by blood, she continued, her voice softening. She was the daughter of Elena Duval, Charlotte's mother, and Theodore Harlan, a man quietly erased from family memory. The Barlows adopted her under pressure and raised her as one of their own, likely to preserve appearances. Charlotte blinked rapidly, looking to her mother, who sat frozen, silent. She planned to reveal it, Jessica said. Vivian wanted to speak to Nate just before the vows, perhaps to warn him, perhaps to confront him. But the truth threatened more than embarrassment. Jessica's gaze rested on Nate. It would have changed everything. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His expression was unreadable. She would have had legal claim to the estate over you, Jessica said gently. But beyond the will, beyond legality, Vivian's discovery threatened the illusion the family had constructed, a carefully tended narrative of legacy, of respectability, of control. Diana's breath caught. And someone, Jessica continued, saw no other way to stop her. There was no need to raise her voice. The truth didn't need volume, it needed precision. I believe the decision was made not in hatred, but in fear. Fear of shame, of scandal, of watching a life and a name rewritten in public. Jessica turned back toward the center of the room. But justice isn't about maintaining illusions. It's about restoring what someone tried to take away. In this case, not just a life, but a voice that had been denied for too long. The silence that followed was no longer tension. It was grief taking shape. Jessica drew a final folded paper from her notebook, a facsimile of the amended Barlow estate will, retrieved with Sheriff Maddox's quiet cooperation. This is a copy of the most recent will, she said, dated 2 weeks ago. It was reprinted after Vivian discovered the clause favoring a sole blood heir. She had it in her possession the day she died, annotated, underlined, with margins in her handwriting. Nate's face had gone still. Not blank, just terribly still. She had realized, Jessica continued, that not only could she claim the estate, but that your standing as the presumed heir was suddenly negotiable. And that possibility, one grounded in legal documentation, could have unraveled generations of assumed legacy. She laid the will on the coffee table. There's something else, she said quietly. Vivian's watch stopped at 10:24. It was found behind the chapel hedge. That's when she was poisoned. The rehearsal was paused. No one saw her drink, but someone saw the opportunity to slip oleander into her bottle, perhaps mistaking silence for success. She allowed the words to breathe. And afterward, Jessica added, someone used lemon oil on their hands. Oleander's toxins cling to the skin. Gardeners use lemon oil to break it down. Only one person at the rehearsal had both access to the garden and reason to fear Vivian's revelation. She turned toward Nate, her voice soft but steady. You. Charlotte let out a quiet gasp. Nate didn't deny it, not immediately. He simply looked at his sister's photograph above the fireplace, then lowered his eyes. "I didn't hate her," he said at last. "But I couldn't let her destroy everything. Not now, not like this." Jessica nodded slowly. The motive hadn't been cruelty. It had been fear, dressed in civility, cloaked in bloodlines, and deadly in its stillness. Jessica's gaze settled softly on Nathaniel's hands, hands that had always seemed so deliberate, too refined for manual work, and yet, at the luncheon, something had caught her eye. A faint citrus scent, not cologne, something else, lemon oil. She had noticed it again that morning in the drawing room, rising subtly as he'd lifted a teacup. An oddity, perhaps. Unless one knew what lemon oil could do. "Nate," she said gently, "why were your hands stained with lemon oil on the morning of the rehearsal?" He didn't answer at first, but his jaw tensed, not in surprise, but recognition. "I have a habit," he said, low. "From working in the greenhouse, citrus oil softens the calluses, keeps everything clean." Jessica tilted her head. "Except it's also what gardeners use to dissolve oleander's toxin, to strip it from skin before it burns." The room had grown very quiet. Charlotte stared at him. "You went out that morning, before the rehearsal?" He nodded once. "I walked the perimeter of the estate. I passed the fence. I picked a few things. I didn't think—" "You didn't think it would stay on you," Jessica said. "But it did." He looked at her now, tired, hollowed. "You said it yourself," she continued. "Vivian never took a sip, but the bottle she carried was hers. The cap was not." Jessica stepped closer, her voice a murmur. "You had time, access, motive, and lemon oil washed over fingertips after something was done that can't be undone." Nathaniel closed his eyes. There was no denial now, just the stillness that comes when truth has no more room to run. Jessica reached into her bag once more and drew out the cracked watch, Vivian's, still stopped at 10:24. "I found this behind the chapel hedge," she said, "just beyond the rehearsal space. A broken strap, frozen time. Not a random loss, but the mark of interruption." Nathaniel looked down at the watch with a stillness that seemed almost reverent. "She followed me," he murmured. "Or maybe I followed her. We said things we couldn't unsay." "You struggled?" Jessica asked, her voice calm but clear. "She tried to reason with me, said she wouldn't ruin the wedding, but that she wouldn't lie anymore either. I reached for her wrist, not hard, just to stop her from walking away. Her watch caught on the garden fence and snapped." Charlotte pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shimmering. Jessica continued, "The watch stopped just before she returned to the chapel. That's when you made your decision." Nathaniel swallowed hard. "It was fast, too fast. I only wanted to delay her. Let me talk to the lawyer, to Mother. I thought if I just bought a little time—" He trailed off. But Jessica knew the break hadn't come with violence, but with the desperation of someone realizing the clock was no longer ticking in their favor. What Vivian wore on her wrist was more than timekeeping. It was the moment truth stopped being manageable and began becoming fatal. Jessica unfolded the final sheet of paper in her notebook, the amended copy of the will. Its edges were creased, its ink dark with urgency, and along the margins faint notations looped in a hand she had come to recognize. "Vivian made notes on this," she said, "but so did someone else." She slid the page toward Charlotte, who stared at it in silence. "These markings, notations about the inheritance clause, line items underlined, initials near signature lines, these weren't Vivian's. I compared them with your letters, Nathaniel. The handwriting matches yours." He flinched, a small gesture, but enough. "You tried to redraw the boundaries," Jessica said. "Perhaps you thought you could propose a new distribution. Perhaps you believed that if you convinced her to wait, to stall the legal process, you could alter the terms in your favor." "I only wanted to protect the family," he said. "But in doing so," Jessica replied, "you put ink to paper not to correct a truth, but to obscure one." The room remained suspended, like a held breath. No one spoke. She touched the edge of the paper again. The will would have gone through. Vivian would have had standing, unless, of course, she never lived long enough to contest it. Jessica's voice was gentle, but unflinching. Annotations in margins are often meant to clarify. Yours only deepened the shadows. And with that, there was no mystery left. Only the question of what guilt does when truth finally settles into ink. Nathaniel lowered himself into the nearest chair, as if the weight of silence had become too much to bear. "I didn't hate her," he said softly. "I envied her, yes. I feared what she would do, but I didn't hate her." Jessica remained standing, her hands folded in front of her, watching him not as a judge, but as someone who had seen too many lives veer off course by one fatal inch. "She was angry," he went on, but not cruel. "I think part of her even hoped I'd accept it. That we could find a way. But I couldn't. I couldn't face my mother with that truth. I couldn't face the town. What would they think? That everything I am was built on a lie?" Charlotte rose slowly from her seat. "That's what you were afraid of. Not the truth, but what it might look like." Nathaniel met her eyes, and for the first time, Jessica saw in him something she hadn't before. Not malice, not calculation, simply collapse. "I didn't know how to fix it," he whispered, "so I made it go away." Jessica said nothing. There was nothing to add. Some crimes wear rage like a coat, others wear shame like a second skin. And this was the kind committed not in a moment of fury, but in the long, silent erosion of a man who believed that losing his legacy meant losing himself. But the truth, as Jessica knew, had a longer memory than any name carved in stone. The morning sun rose soft and golden over Elmswood Cove, warming the mist as it curled along the shoreline. The chapel bells remained silent. There would be no procession today, no vows beneath stained glass. Charlotte stood by the inn's garden gate, her suitcase beside her, and a small travel case tucked beneath one arm. Jessica joined her, offering the kind of smile meant for partings that leave something tender behind. "I sent a message to the guests," Charlotte said, her voice even. "Told them the wedding's been cancelled. I didn't explain why." Jessica nodded gently. "You don't have to." Charlotte hesitated. "I thought love was the reason for a wedding. But lately it felt like we were all marching to preserve a history, someone else's version of it." Jessica placed a hand on hers. "It takes courage to know when to start over. Even more when the truth changes what you thought you were building." Charlotte's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I'm going to Florence for a while. A music residency, something I applied for last year and forgot about." "That sounds like the right kind of unexpected," Jessica replied. From inside the inn, Elena watched silently through the curtain. Jessica felt the tension in Charlotte's shoulders as they exchanged a final embrace, one shaped not by goodbye, but quiet survival. The carriage door shut with a hollow sound, the wheels turned slowly over gravel, and the past rolled quietly behind them. Jessica remained at the gate until the carriage turned out of sight. It was, in the end, a wedding undone, not by scandal, but by truth. A wedding that never was. And perhaps, in its absence, something more honest was finally allowed to begin. Later that day, Jessica returned once more to the chapel. The doors were unlocked, as if the building itself knew there was still something unfinished inside. She stepped into the hushed nave, her footsteps echoing faintly across the flagstone. The sunlight slanted through the stained glass in soft hues of amber and violet, painting the pews with warmth that no longer reached anyone seated there. She let her gaze linger on the altar where flowers had once been arranged and vows rehearsed. The floral remnants were now gathered in a pale ceramic vase at the far end, wilted but still fragrant. Jessica moved slowly down the center aisle, trailing one hand along the polished wood of each pew. Her mind wandered, not toward Vivian or Nathaniel, but toward Charlotte, toward a woman brave enough to walk away from a ceremony when it stopped feeling like her own. She paused near the vestry door. It remained shut, silent behind its oak grain. How many secrets had passed through it? How many truths had waited too long behind that threshold? Near the front, ivy pressed insistently against the windows. It had been trimmed back, but not entirely. Some roots, Jessica thought, always find a way through. Not out of defiance, but memory. A quiet kind of resistance. She sat for a while in the second pew from the front, folding her hands over her notebook, letting the chapel's stillness fill the spaces left by grief and revelation. Not all places of worship were meant for faith alone. Some were built for reckoning, and this one, wrapped in lace, shadowed by history, had heard its final confession. Back at the inn, Jessica passed by Charlotte's old suite. The door stood ajar, the bed had been stripped, the suitcase removed, but a single item remained on the vanity, the lace veil. Jessica stepped inside, her movements soft, reverent. The tear was no longer visible. Someone, Charlotte, almost certainly, had stitched it closed by hand. The thread was pale, barely distinguishable from the original lace. The work was delicate, imperfect in only the most human of ways. Jessica reached out and gently lifted the veil. The seam, where it had once been torn, now held. It bore no illusion of untouched purity, just a visible history of what had once been broken, and then chosen to be repaired. She folded the veil carefully and placed it back into its protective satin box. Not discarded, not ruined, simply returned. A symbol, she thought, not of what had failed, but of what had been faced. So many people spend their lives preserving appearances. Charlotte had chosen to mend something only after accepting that it had been damaged. Jessica stepped out of the room, leaving the veil behind, no longer an artifact of ceremony, but a quiet testament to growth, honesty, and renewal. There would be no bride walking down the aisle at Allendale Chapel this season, but there had been healing, and that, Jessica knew, was no less sacred. That evening, Jessica sat by the window in her room, the soft scratching of pen on paper, the only sound aside from the distant hum of the sea. Her notebook lay open, half filled with observations, timelines, and the gentle unravelling of motive. She paused mid-sentence and looked up. It had not been the most violent case she'd ever encountered, nor the most theatrical, but it had been one of the saddest. Not because of what had been lost, but because of what had been withheld. Love, truth, names, roots, all buried in the name of image. The kind of legacy that can look like tradition until someone dares to question it. She wrote slowly. Vivian Barlow was not a danger because of what she intended to do. She was a danger because she had nothing left to lose. And when people have nothing left to protect except their truth, they become very brave, often too brave for those still clinging to shadows. Jessica paused, watching her own reflection in the glass. In the margins, she added a final note. Legacy should never be a prison, and no secret is worth a life. She closed the notebook gently and placed it beside the lamp. The wind stirred through the curtains. In the quiet, she thought not of Nathaniel's mistake, but of how long it must have taken for that fear to become a silence so complete it disguised itself as duty. And in that silence, murder had taken root. But now the truth had found its page, and in ink, Jessica gave it a place to rest. Before bed, Jessica stood at the window watching the chapel's steeple fade into evening mist. Somewhere within its ivy-covered walls, the echoes of vows never spoken still lingered. She folded her arms and whispered to the darkened sky, not as a question, but as a closing thought. In trying to silence the past, we often awaken the very ghosts we fear, and sometimes the truth is not a weapon, but a gift we're too afraid to unwrap. A gull cried softly in the distance. Jessica smiled faintly, closed the shutters, and reached for the lamp. Tomorrow she would return to Cabot Cove, but tonight she let the silence stay, no longer haunted, but whole. Some endings don't come with justice or vengeance, only a quiet reckoning, and the hope that truth, at last, has found a place to rest. But I wonder, was it truly hatred that led to the final act, or a desperate kind of love, warped by fear and time? I'd love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts or theory in the comments below. And if this story kept you company tonight, give it a gentle like, pass it along to a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe for more tales that ask as much as they answer.